There's a lot been going on in our little watch niche recently, so today I've gathered together all the hot button watch news to understand what's going on with Swiss watches in China, why Rolex is going big guns in court, and what's happening over at the Swatch Group that's got them hot and bothered. Stay to the end for a pat on the head. Wouldn't it be fun if we were wearing matching sweatshirts? I know I for one would be totally humbled and blessed, and you can too by purchasing a delightful item of merchandise from the link below. It really helps to support what I do, so thank you. In 2016, freshly appointed Omega CEO Reinhold Eichlermann made an unexpected admission. Apart from the straps and ruby bearings, he said in an interview with the Financial Times, everything that goes into an Omega watch is made here. Where is here? Switzerland, of course. Swiss made, along with the origin of manufacture of a number of luxury brands and segments, has come under fire recently following a social media campaign by Chinese factories purporting to make the expensive products we buy, but at a fraction of the cost the brands are charging. And it seems there are elements of that are true. Eichlermann was addressing the situation in particular because a year later, in 2017, the rules around Swiss-made were set to tighten, increasing the amount by value in a Swiss-made watch from 50 to 60%. That meant that the amount by value that could be made elsewhere, like China, would be reducing from 50 to 40%. So on that basis, it seems that neither case of Swiss-made can be explicitly made in China in its entirety, but for certain it's possible for some of it to be made in China, or India, or Vietnam, or even Mauritius, wherever the skill sets lie and the labour costs are cheaper. To be clear, there's no doubt over the capability of China to manufacture even the most complex watchmaking component. After all, China has become a leading producer of precision optics and microelectronics, both requiring just as much if not more precision as a high-quality mechanical watch. Even Switzerland got its start in watchmaking by badly copying its more capable neighbours, until it became both cheaper and better at it. The question around component production in watchmaking had previously arisen after customers of Omega had noticed China listed as the country of origin on order sheets for spare links, indicating that some, if not all, of the bracelet was made in China. Under the rules of Swiss made, that is allowed, particularly because the lower production costs in China versus Switzerland means more of the work can be done in China as an overall fraction of the watch's value. Indeed, in a 2017 Reuters article about the impending change to the rules around Swiss-made, an anonymous dial supplier acknowledged that its Swiss-made dials were indeed made outside of Switzerland, with a complex final assembly adding enough cost to the product to bias it to within the rule set of Swiss-made. The basis of value as a metric for the ratio of Swiss-made can therefore turn what seems like a pretty clear-cut rule into something much murkier, as brands are encouraged by that language to find ways to build as much as possible within the 40% value range, introducing expensive finishing and assembly processes to carefully balance the value. The addition of research and development costs contributing to the rule only makes things murkier. This approach to Swiss-made varies by brand. Of course, watch companies targeting a more affordable price point are driven to skirting the line as closely as possible. But for a big, expensive manufacturer like Omega or Rolex, the situation is more a question of just how much profit they want to make. In the case of Rolex, a brand that is historically less transparent than Omega, it underwent a process of purchasing many of its legacy Swiss suppliers to combine them all under one roof, incorporating many of the capabilities usually left to suppliers within its own halls. In typical Rolex fashion, it was a move that was made well ahead of industry trends towards in-house, setting itself up well against a changing tide. Through the 90s, Rolex purchased its bracelet maker, Gay Frères, then Genex, its case maker, and Baylor, its dial maker, completing the picture in 2004 with the acquisition of its movement maker, Aigler. These four were all Swiss companies that existed from a time before making parts in China became viable, and so it appears that Rolex has no need to make anything in China. But we don't know for sure. There aren't any telltale traces as there have been with Omega. But to speculate for a moment, it seems unlikely that, for example, a Rolex box is made in Switzerland, or the little plastic hang tag. In fact, you'll struggle to find the word Swiss made on the Rolex website outside of the images of its watches. Instead, Rolex says the following. Rolex creates, manufactures, assembles and tests all its watches exclusively in Switzerland, thanks to the know-how and commitment of more than 9,000 employees at the brand's 4 sites, all at the cutting edge of technological progress. From Acacius, its world headquarters in Geneva, where the watches are developed and assembled, to Bienne, where the movements are manufactured, from Plan Les Watts, where the watch cases and bracelets are produced, to Cherbourg, where the dials, Cerachrom bezels and Cerachrom bezel inserts in ceramic are crafted, and where the brand's gemology and gem-setting expertise is located. Sophisticated high-technology equipment is a reflection of Rolex's distinction. A 5th site is under construction in Buhl in the canton of Fribourg. They go on. By integrating the entirety of its production on 4 sites, Rolex has made a strategic, bold and visionary choice. It thus has an unparalleled production facility linking high value-added skills with state-of-the-art technologies. Rolex can, independently, express its creativity and innovative spirit according to its own standards of excellence. Each Rolex watch is created according to superlative production criteria. Each element is developed, produced and checked with continuous attention to even the smallest details. I think that's pretty clear. The core components of the watches are given real places of origin in Switzerland with a direct commitment to their production that exists outside of the language of Swiss made. And it seems Rolex isn't the only Swiss watchmaker making its own statement, with H. Moser & Company taking a stand in 2017 by removing the Swiss-made label completely, in protest of the lax regulations that would classify a watch entirely made in Switzerland and one 60% made by value as both Swiss-made. It seems then that this social media campaign by Chinese factories taking credit for the production of Swiss watches could be easily countered by a level of transparency as offered in Rolex's example. And unfortunately, the reason it can exist at all is because of opaque brand behavior. In the example of Omega, despite a candid and very public admission by its CEO that its watches aren't entirely made in Switzerland, there are still communications to be found on its website saying the following. Omega is proud to include the Swiss-made mark on all of its watches. This simple wording guarantees a standard of quality that has been established over many centuries and is today a world-renowned symbol of excellence. Every part of an Omega watch is made in Switzerland, which goes far beyond the industry's required standard. This means that the manufacturing levels as well as the aesthetic and technical levels meet Switzerland's highest demands. On top of Omega's own proven excellence, the Swiss-made mark provides customers with even more assurance and trust in the watch they wear on their wrist. Yeah, Omega, that thing you're doing that you think is helping, it's not helping. The recent surprise threat of a 50% tariff with the EU following reportedly stalled negotiations serves as a reminder that the ongoing talks between the US and the rest of the world are far from over. For the Swiss watch industry in particular, this latest play leaves it unaffected since it's not a member of the EU. However, that's not to say it isn't facing its own challenges. If you're unfamiliar, during Watches and Wonders, the Swiss watch industry's biggest annual watch trade fair, it was announced that 31% tariffs would be put in place on Switzerland. Following a reduction in spend from the Chinese market, the US has become the largest consumer of luxury Swiss watches, with 17% of total watch exports from Switzerland heading to the States. With retailer margins somewhere around the 30 to 40% mark, the tariff marked a critical blow for the industry and immediately prompted negotiations. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent offered his thanks to Switzerland for proactively seeking a trade agreement, saying on a visit to Geneva that Switzerland has moved to the front of the queue for trade deals, so we value that. It seems that part of the agreement with Switzerland will be a trade training program that will re-skill the US manufacturing sector. Bessent also criticised the EU for being slow, resulting in a threat of higher tariffs, whilst overall tariffs have been temporarily reduced to 10% for 90 days during the negotiation, with the exception of China. But what do these tariffs actually mean and how do they work? First off, they're applied to the value of the product as sold into the US, which means that watches sold to a retailer or distributor are valued at the wholesale price. That's less than the price paid by the consumer, usually by some 30 to 40%. Watches sold directly to consumers, however, are valued on the retail price, so the full whack takes the brunt of the tariff. As well as that, tariffs on watches aren't calculated based on the watch as a singular entity. The watch is considered as three distinct components: the case, the strap, and the movement, with each facing tariffs based on its own country of origin and value, determined by the last significant operation. So, for example, a precious case or exotic leather strap will contribute a higher amount to the total value than more ordinary materials. And, more importantly, a case or movement of Chinese origin will face much higher tariffs. China was already involved in a trade war with the US before Switzerland joined the fray. On February 4th, 2025, a 10% tariff came into effect on China, to which China responded by instigating a 15% tariff on US-derived coal and gas, and 10% on oil, heavy machinery and vehicles, including pickup trucks. The US pushed back with an additional 10% added to the tariff on China, to which China reciprocated by adding a 10% tariff on agricultural products. In addition, a US global tariff of 25% on steel and aluminium created an effective 45% tariff on steel and aluminium from China. Then we reached Watches and Wonders, when a full 34% tariff was applied to China, which China matched in return. The US added a further 50%, and so did China. The US raised to 145%, and China to 125%. It's at this point the US made exempt consumer electronics like smartphones and computers from the growing tariffs, capping them at 20%, whilst China did the same for US-made semiconductors. That's when trade negotiations began between the US and China, in Geneva ironically, with the US cutting tariffs back to 30% and China back to 10%. Why is this of significance to the watch industry? Because as we've discussed with the Swiss-made rule, many manufacturers source significant components of their watches from China. A steel case from China was at one point potentially subject to a 45% tariff. And since the case is isolated in the tariff calculations and can be determined to have had its last significant operation in China, it would require a price increase to compensate. That would upset the balance of value made in Switzerland and could therefore end up in breach of Swiss-made laws. There's an even greater issue for micro-brands that are either in part or in whole made in China. With a case and movement sourced from China, at the peak of the trade war between the two nations, a micro-brand's watches sold direct to consumers in the US could end up costing well over double. For now, even with a calming of the storm, direct-to-consumer micro-brands significantly made in China still face a hefty 30% tariff, enough to drastically impact their competitive ability. The future is still looking uncertain, with a further disagreement between China and the US regarding the production of Chinese AI chips. For Swiss watches, however, or at least ones that can be reasonably demonstrated to be Swiss, the road ahead is looking far better than it could have been. With Swiss pharmaceuticals exempt from tariffs, what with 2 of the top 10 largest pharmaceutical companies based in Switzerland, exemption for watches isn't completely out of the question, although it's unlikely they'll be rolled back from 10%. Meanwhile, watch companies based in the EU are now facing similar concerns as Brussels drags its heels. If you're enjoying this conversation, why not join me for more looks into the Swiss watch industry over with my lovely Patreons over on Patreon, where I post extra videos and we chat about all things watches. I'd love to see you there. In February, Rolex came out on top in a court case against Skeleton Concept, a French company that modifies Rolex watches. The court ruled that Skeleton Concept had infringed upon the Rolex trademark by using the branding in a misleading way that implied endorsement by Rolex. This comes after a long list of cases against businesses modifying Rolex watches. But what is it exactly that Rolex is trying to achieve, since almost all of these companies are incredibly small and not particularly well known? It's all about protecting the trademark. A trademark, in the case of Rolex, the crown logo and brand name, is used to distinguish products or services, and in the case of Rolex, it has what courts have determined a highly renowned brand. This is a reputation built over a lot of time and expense that gives Rolex an earned competitive advantage. Should another brand leverage the Rolex trademark for their own benefit, they would be engaging in unfair competition. But these modified watches are a very different proposition to outright fakes, where the biggest issue with trademark infringement lies. So why is Rolex so heavily focused on modified watches? Because, in law, precedent is everything. In the case of a modified watch, if it is determined that a single component can be replaced and the watch resold under the original trademark, then why not 2 components, or 10, or all of them? And if one of those replaced components, such as a dial, can have the trademarks reapplied where they were originally, then why can't they be reapplied elsewhere, or indeed anywhere? As soon as a precedent is set for even a single component to be lawfully replaced and sold under the original trademark, or that trademark reapplied in its original place, the grounds have been set for third parties to argue the case for watches that bear little resemblance, or originality, to the brand's own, with a potential ultimate, albeit unlikely, conclusion that fake watches could be legalized through a loophole. Rolex, of course, has to cut this off at the roots. Rolex has successfully halted the activities of multiple watch modification companies, including La Californienne in 2019 and Becketime in 2024, but also in 2024 lost out to Artisans de Genève. Rolex filed against Artisans de Genève in 2020 and would have been successful had Artisans de Genève not heavily pivoted in a very clever way. Previously a retailer of its own modified pieces, Artisans de Genève hid its website behind a giant disclaimer clarifying the lack of association between the brands, removed almost every instance of the Rolex logo and brand mark from its pages, and, most importantly, stopped selling modified watches. Now its services are exclusively the modification of customers' own watches, and not the modification and sale of watches it procures itself. This takes advantage of trademark exhaustion, a situation where trademark law no longer applies to the private owner of a product. A private owner of a Rolex can do whatever they like to it or with it, so long as it's not commercial and doesn't imply association with Rolex. So with Artisans de Genève not advertising the Rolex logo in its communications, disassociating itself in its language with Rolex, including a clear statement about the voiding of the original manufacturer warranty, and only working on watches supplied by private customers for their own personal use, its business was determined to be legal. But hang on a minute. On Artisans de Genève's website, where it lists its watches as challenges and not products, and on its Instagram page, there are pictures of watches with the logo clearly present. This is where it becomes a grey area, one that's been bounced back to the lower courts to figure out. Because what is legal is the use of the trademark to advertise the service and not the product. Since the service is to modify a product, it becomes more challenging to determine if the use becomes misleading or not. This whole situation of modification and brand trademark is not exclusive to the watch industry. Porsche and Singer have recently settled outside of court on a similar matter, with the latter's website mirroring Artisans de Genève's with its avoidance of logos and clear language disassociating it from Porsche. Like Artisans de Genève, Singer requires customers to provide a donor for its modifications, although it does actively help source them, as I'm sure Artisans de Genève do too. So what about Skeleton Concept? They too offer a modification service and not product for sale, and disassociate themselves clearly with the language in their communications. Where the court found them in breach was in the presentation of their work in a misleading way that implies endorsement from Rolex, with the product and not service advertised clearly showing the Rolex trademark. It's a complex and long-winded battle, but considering the level of resource Rolex has applied to building its reputation, as we saw earlier in the video, it's unsurprising that it will do everything to protect it. If you, like me, have ever pondered what it might take to fix Breguet, you're not alone, because investment firm founder and owner of 0.5% of Swatch Group shares Stephen Wood put together a manifesto for change as part of a bid to be elected onto the board of directors at the Swatch Group, owner of Breguet, Blancpain, Omega, Longines and Tissot, amongst others. Despite Swatch Group profits falling a colossal 75% last year, and a share price falling 24% in that period too, and 75% in the last decade, Wood's bid failed. Why? Because although the founding family, the Hayeks, only own 25% of the shares, they control 44% of the voting rights. Nick Hayek Jr., son of Swatch's founder Nick Hayek Sr., who is considered by many to be the saviour of the post-quartz crisis Swiss watch industry, seems undeterred, telling shareholders to invest elsewhere if they don't like it. This is despite Breguet, one of many faltering brands within the Swatch Group, operating at a loss, with a revenue half of where it was 2 decades ago. For those hoping that newly appointed Breguet CEO Gregory Kissling will be able to turn the tide on the brand's fortunes, here's the scale of the task at hand. Back when Breguet's revenue was double what it is now, 20 years ago, it performed as an equal to Patek Philippe. Today, however, Patek Philippe sales are 10 times greater than Breguet's. And it's not just Breguet that's struggling, with Omega sales falling 20% over the last 5 years, despite Hayek's confidence in the collaboration Swatch-Moonswatch bringing more positive attention to Omega. Longines is suffering a similar fate, dropping 29% in sales over the same period. Overall, the Swatch Group has dropped from a 1.3 billion Swiss franc profit high in 2013 to just over 200 million Swiss franc profit last year. That's still a sizable profit, but a long way off where it once was. It could be assumed that the Swatch Group's struggles come as a byproduct of being controlled by just one family. However, both the Richemont Group, owners of Cartier, Vacheron Constantin, A. Lange & Söhne and more, and LVMH, who've got Tag Heuer, Hublot and Zenith in their fold, are in similar positions, with singular shareholders controlling the decision-making. Yet their year-on-year share value growth has been relatively consistent over the last few decades. And at a micro level, LVMH has also demonstrated the opportunity in reviving a prestigious high-end brand with the relaunch of Daniel Roth, building momentum and excitement for a watch company ironically founded by the man who breathed life back into Breguet in the 1980s. There's no question that Breguet is an untapped opportunity for success, more a question of why that success hasn't yet been unearthed. Reports of poor company culture at the Swatch Group, and in particular staff turnover 6 times higher than average, suggest a hostile working environment and perhaps not one that breeds success and innovation. Rumours that Hayek has a controlling management style that sees him heavily involved in many aspects of the individual brand's day-to-day operations suggest that nothing much is going to change in the immediate future. So then, it's no surprise that Steve Wood's proposals, which include a top-level view on how to reposition the group's crowning jewel brands, have fallen flat. Woods in particular draws attention to the Swatch Group's focus on the entry-level segment and the Chinese market, both of which have been hit hardest over the last few years, with watches at more premium prices seeing the most growth, and the US taking the lead as the biggest opportunity market for luxury watches. Breguet's reliance on China, for example, in the absence of an international brand strategy, has caused it the biggest problems. All that's left, in the wake of a dwindling share price and neglected legends like Breguet, is to wonder why the Hayek family aren't doing more to elevate the incredible portfolio they have in their stable, to stem the bleeding of what should be a very profitable enterprise. It's not like the group is short on funds, being debt-free and with a strong balance sheet, plus an enormous array of capabilities within the supply chain that even brings in profitability from external industries like the consumer electronics market. A spokesperson for the Hayek family offered a clue, saying that a private buyout by the Hayeks would be a very attractive option for them. However, the family's philosophy is not to go into debt. If the Hayeks can't afford to buy the remaining shares as they stand and take the company off the stock market entirely, and don't want to borrow money to buy them either, then another option is to simply reduce the price of those shares until they become affordable. Given that Swatch Group shares are currently the most shorted on the European exchange, where traders speculate on the loss of share price, it's not unreasonable to ponder the long-term strategy of the Hayek family, and in particular offers some clarity perhaps on Nick Hayek Jr.'s blasé attitude to investors ditching stock. If he could buy back the entirety of the Swatch Group and take it private, then what would he do? Considering he already has close to a controlling stake in the business and doesn't particularly engage with the remaining shareholders, I'm not really sure. What do you think about the Swatch Group position, as well as the situation with Chinese-made watches, Swiss tariffs, and modified Rolex watches? I'd love to see what thoughts and insights you have on the topics. If you enjoyed the video, it would be incredible if you could make sure you're subscribed and like the video as well. And of course, as promised, here's your pat on the head. See you next time.